you, Christine. Can you hear? Is this working? Okay. I want to say a few words before we get into our conversation. I want to take a moment to offer some thanks. And the thanks are to Barney Kulak, my longtime friend and a photographer who has now become a noted publisher. And I'm reading, it's my teleprompter, right? I need a teleprompter or things might go terribly wrong. It was Barney who had the idea for a book of my selected writings, and it's he, with a little help from some friends, who has seen it through to this celebration today. Without me, no texts. Without Barney, no book.
Was that it?
That's it. Your turn.
I'm glad you've now left the teleprompter behind, though I too want to thank Barney Kulak and congratulate him and you on the publication of Is Art History. The publication is right there. It's a marvelously produced, beautiful book. I know you like handsome books that you can still, where touch and vision are important and activated, and it is just that. And it is full of the most marvelous content, much of it new. The book includes, as many of you probably know, a range of essays, interviews, conversations, invited presentations, and reviews of books and art shows by Svetlana over many years, going all the way back to 1959, published in 1960, when she was a graduate student. One of these amazing graduate papers at Harvard about Vasari's lives that was instantly published because her advisor, Ernst Gombrich, of course, recognized brilliance when he saw it. And it goes all the way from that article, that was probably one that many of us who were art history students at one point read and cherished, and it goes all the way to 2023, a review of the wonderful show Juan de la Pareja at the Met, and her review of that for Phi Beta Kappa notes. One of the wonderful things about Svetlana's publications over the years is they appear in many places. Svetlana's reach, your reach is very wide. You don't just write for art historians, you also write for artists, importantly, for critics, and for anyone who would like to know more about this wonderful thing we call art that human beings have made since they were conscious human beings. The range of these articles is extraordinary. These essays from this art literature of the Renaissance through her start in 16th and 17th century painting of the Netherlands, Bruegel, Vermeer, of course the art of describing, Velázquez, and of course also these new models for grounding Netherlandish painting that did not look Italian, so to speak, in very rich contexts of their time, scientific, educational, domestic, economic contexts. The essays, her work of course has involved Rembrandt as a kind of pictorial entrepreneur of the self. She writes and talks about habits of looking in museums and how that's different in France and Germany and the United States. You can read about her responses to the philosophical and critical interests of other art historians and critics, a deep engagement that I think comes out of your beginnings in literature, your academic journey started in literature, and then of course, in recent years, very trenchant criticism in a wide range of publications of contemporary painting and installation art, and above all, photography, Barney's love. The book also gives little introductions from Svetlana to many of the texts, not all, so you get a kind of little self-portrait of the scholar and critic, from young woman to no longer so very young woman, and as a relentlessly observant and thoughtful person in the world. I first met you in 1987 in your office at Berkeley. I was a little struck and applying to graduate schools.
She came to interview me to see if she wanted to study with me, and she decided no, she didn't. She preferred to study with Avery, Cunningham, Beethoven, and NYU, right?
It was a locational decision. as you made later. I remember especially the time that she took to talk with me and the other students who were outside, her Berkeley students who were outside ready to talk to her. It was very impressive actually. And I remember one specific, really great answer she gave as I posed her these, frankly, sophomoric questions. I was not an art history major, so I didn't know much. But I still recount this answer to my students in Netherlandish art. I said, but what about, your book you're describing, you never say anything about that fabled tolerance of the Dutch in the 17th century, I said. And she said, yes, it was very good for business. Which of course there's a deep truth to that. We became friends some 15 years later when we had both moved to New York. And I have looked at a lot of art with you over the years, old art, new art, all sorts of art. I've had the privilege of writing about your work and especially of being in conversation with you in many private and also public interactions, many of them disputatious, but always enriching and broadening my own horizon of understanding of what I value and see in art, and I hope it is the same for you. Let's get started with some questions. I first read the essay, Is Art History?, which is the namesake of the book, and was first published in 1977. I read it in graduate school 10 years later, and I loved it, especially for its title, Is Art History? Most art history essays at the time had at least one subtitle, and they were long and had many adjectives. Is art history? What is objective? What is noun and what is adjective here? And the titles seemed such a double or even a triple. Is art history? Is art history? Is art history? Does it even exist? It was fascinating to me, and so I want to ask you, thinking about why you gave the book that title, and what prompted you to write that essay.
Well, that wasn't prompting. Those were the days when you were asked. In fact, I have had a very lucky life where I've hardly, in fact, applied for anything. I've just been invited. Those days are gone now because it's not fair, and I suppose it isn't fair, but I was a lucky recipient of that unfairness, and I grant it. And so Steve Graybard, who at that point was the editor of Daedalus, which was a marvelous, I'm a member of the American Academy, but it's not what it was then. It's gotten bigger, it's gotten more political, and Steve Daedalus wanted an article. He commissioned articles on the state of academic disciplines. It was still a time when there was a confidence that academic disciplines actually counted for something. People wanted to teach them, students wanted to study them, and we just were doing it. I mean, there wasn't much fuss about it. The fuss was internal, but it was about the discipline, not about the greater world. And so he asked me in 1977 if I would write, in 1976 I suppose, I was at that point at the Stanford Center for Behavioral Studies, and wonderful, wonderful years, 75, 76. And Steve asked me to write on the state of art history. And that was just the moment when Tim Clark, Michael Baxendall, and I included in that essay also Leo Steinberg and Michael Fried. Imagine all of us were operating at the same time. And a common thing between several of these people was to look at what we then call the circumstances. What is going around when the art is going on around the art when it's being made. And so I wrote some of the judgments that I made in that I do not agree with now. I think I was very harsh on Baxendall, who then became my companion. So obviously I changed radically in my view of Michael Baxendall, and we wrote a book together, so that changed. But I was hard on him, but I was trying to explain what I thought, and it was true, was a kind of new mood in the field at that point. And it was striking, and it was in common between all these people. But at the same time, so that question, is art history, meant what is the relationship between art and its historical circumstances? Is art really its historical circumstances? that was what I meant, although I rather loved the title because, as Mariët suggested, it had all other it was ambiguous. And that was perfect. And now it still works today, although probably today it would mean, is there such a thing as art history? And it's a very good question. There really isn't anymore. I mean, the certainty that you can do that, and as we did it mostly in relationship to European art, is just now gone. I mean, it's, in fact, it's forbidden. It's not just gone. It's not approved of. Okay, but I ended it with a worry, and I was worried because my question was, you know, is really that what art amounts to? Are we really looking at art in order to get hold of the circumstances? And of course, for me, the answer is no. We're looking at art for the art, which marvelously is able to somehow, I don't know if I want to use the word transcend, that's a big word for Walker Evans, and he used it a particular way, which in a way is able to kind of rise above the circumstances and do something beyond the circumstances. So even though I was of that movement, and that is central to my work in a way, I didn't want to reduce art to circumstances. And of course, I think that is indeed what happened. Many people, many art historians became kind of not very good social historians. Why not go and do social history? Why wreck the art by trapping it in social history, is my view. Okay.
I think we all kind of got that point when you wrote it, and it's very interesting to me that the particular authors with whom you engaged, Baxendal, Fried, Steinberg, you're quite different people. You write different kinds of circumstantial and textual histories, you might say. But what you share is that each of you in that essay also are very sustained lookers at works of art, can describe them wonderfully, even if you do very different things with them. And in the essay, and throughout many of these essays in this wonderful companion, you talk about the durational quality and the durational requirements of looking at art of a certain kind that fed the kind of art history that you were wondering maybe is history indeed, is over, so to speak. I'm not sure all of us agree with it, but it's a good question. You describe beautifully yourself the process of looking at works of art in your historical work, also in your critical art criticism of more recent vintage. It's a pleasure, in fact, of your work that replicates your pleasure in looking at art as art rather than history. And then you say, you end this essay in such an elegiac mode. I want to read this sentence. When you say, with nowadays such a profusion of objects and cultures, with old hierarchies crumbling, how does one justify such an occupation of looking? It is a daunting question. That was 1977. How would you answer that question today? Because you still keep on looking.
Yeah, I think in my heart of hearts, my mind of minds, I knew I had the same answer then that I have now. I mean, when I too have looked through this book, I mean, I don't normally look at my work chronologically this way, and thanks to Barney and the little work from other people and myself, I can do it, and I think it is consistent right through. In other words, yes, I think what I was looking and wanting to look at when I was writing in 1960s on Bruegel is the same thing right through. So I think, but I thought there was a threat, in a way, from the very thing I was putting my finger on in that essay.
The threat of this dispersal as we look out to the world across time and places.
I think that many art historians, as I say, are just second-rate social historians. I mean, what are they writing about? I mean, they just use the art as a way to find something to do.
Okay, we'll get back into some of these things, but this is such an interesting question because, of course, your own, the intervention why I wanted to come and study with you was the art of describing in 1983. This major intervention in the historiography of European painting of the Renaissance humanist vintage, where you recognize that, of course, Dutch 17th century art wasn't these pictures of everyday life, as you say, the long Sunday of life, the secularized kind of art of the everyday, as it's often described, that there was no place for that in American or in Italian Vasari-esque kind of historiography. And you can see in the art of describing, and you have the impulse to that. There are lots of breadcrumbs to that book here, leading to the book, including the essay Describe or Narrate, even earlier, 1976, which came out of your work on Bruegel's Peasants, and then a broader question of realism in art. What's so interesting to me about the book, and you see already here, is you do precisely that. You widen the whole context to what is indeed a social history too of the scientific culture of the Netherlands at the time.
But that is not the point of the book. The point of the book is not to teach people about the scientific culture or anything like that. It's to see what the artists were making use of. You know, culture is a huge, great, big, wide thing. Art only uses very small parts of it. Very small parts of it. What we're interested in is what the artist is related to and makes use of. We're not interested in taking the art as a way to explore the culture. We're trying to find what we can find in the culture that helps us look at the art. And those are two very different processes. And I think many, many students who followed the art history article, followed that moment, did not know what to do. And they thought, well, I don't know what to write, I'll just go out and find out something about social history. That's what I said to you. So that book, it opens up, but its opening up is really a closing in on what Dutch art could do.
What it could do, I think that is a good description for the reset in what then would become, for a while, the field that I plowed, the field of Dutch 17th century painting. Although I too became a little impatient with the professional procedural of the discipline, which so clearly had been setting in, and I think your book and these essays in some ways draw a contrast to, or even actually resist quite argumentatively with good evidence, I would say. Now, you're very precise in your language, which is one of the joys of reading you. Thinking about narrating and describing. Narrating as the Italo mode, if you will, and describing as a broad northerly mode, an alternative, with all the exceptions. Do you think that, I think the narrating part is easy to see in Italian history painting and so forth, and even in portraiture. What about describing? Would you today still use that language for what paintings do?
Well, there was a smart review of the book by a really smart French critic named Louis Marin. And he said, you're not talking, it was written, I think, published in October, I believe, in American magazine. But they had close contacts with France. And he said, he liked the book, but he said, you're using the word, you're talking about depiction, not description. And he had a philosophical turn of mind, and I thought that was very smart. I mean, he's right. I'm talking about but the art of describing, it's a good title, right? In other words, that's why I picked it. I mean, it just, so I think I don't know, I'm not quite answering your question, Mariët, but that's the point. Describing, we could talk about that. It's just describe or narrate was a handy handle to get on these two different traditions, who hadn't been, they'd be considered two different traditions, but not in the way that I pushed it.
Well, I would agree, and I think it was another example. It was the second essay, or the first essay 2 years in a row, that were short questions, which is a really nice way to do a title. And I think describing does easily signal what we love about Dutch art and what makes it, in a sense, great. And I think the other thing that I particularly found compelling about it, that if you're nerdly like me, you'll remember that the art of painting, Vermeer's great work, with which you could start it on this, I think, includes on its map the word descriptio, not descriptio. So I think there's every good reason to do it, but I wanted to get to this idea of depiction and picturing. There's of course different ways of picturing that can be narrational, so I actually can see that describing is maybe more precise actually than depicting. But what I find so fascinating is how that love of the depicting that Dutch people do in this descriptive way, how you have a very similar sensitivity, you have a great sensitivity to that. You have a similar sensitivity and love for photography. And at first when you got into photography, I thought that was counterintuitive for me, because you so love made things, and the fact that artists use, as you say, these materials and work with them. You wrote a book-long essay that's not in here, of course. Your book-long essay, Roof Life, in 2013, is in so many ways about photography and the distance it affords the viewer and the artist. And I wonder if you can say something about how you think about photography in relation to your first love of painting.
Well, look, I mean, there was a long footnote which became rather famous among photography people in the art describing, in which I brought up the question of, is photography like painting or is it quite separate? This is an interesting thing. And I picked to work on Evans, I think, because Walker Evans thought photography was separate. And I am on the side of those people who think it's different. But there are very strong people who think it's similar. And actually, I belong to a group called the New York Institute for the Humanities, and which is unfortunately moved from down where I live further away. So I go there less often in presence. And a member of it, when I was a member, was Janet Malcolm. And once when she heard I was working on photography, she said, "You working on photography?" And she wasn't a very pleasant woman. In fact, nobody says that about her, but she was really unpleasant. And she was. And I said to her, the art of describing, Janet, because in fact, the photography is tied, and you're quite right to ask the question, Mariët, it is tied to what interested me in Dutch art. But and that footnote exactly, I can see it on the left-hand page at the bottom because it's the same edition and it keeps going on in print. It was a long argument about is in fact photography like painting or not? And the people who think it's different actually have had a stronger argument than the people who think it's continuous. There are people who think it's continuous. There are people in Chicago, maybe Jill Snyder, I can't remember who it was, thought it was continuous. Absolutely not convincing. So for me, the interest was to get to something that was like Dutch painting, but not. I don't think that's why I got interested in photography. I got interested in photography because I knew Barney, I knew photographers in town, and I didn't know quite what to do next. And I just got interested in photographs. And at that time, more than now, I think, we're talking now back in, when was that back into the early teens, mid-teens of this century, it was a very vibrant medium. I think it's less so. At this moment, I think it's less so. It's gotten all artsy. It's forgotten to be a photograph. And also cameras are gone, and film is gone. It's basic things. But you're right also, to pick another thing, about making. Making a photograph is not, there's no, I think that my book about Evans is about how he made photographs. But making a photograph is totally different from making a painting. You can't put your finger on it. You can't. In other words, you have film when you used to have film, and then you print the film, and then the film can be printed at any size. Any photograph, printed photograph is a expansion of this little thing. So what are we talking about making? I found it just fascinating. It was a completely different thing, completely different. Have I wandered from your question?
No, you haven't really, and I was going to ask the question whether a photograph was made, in Holland you say foto maken, or whether it is taken. And I think you would shade to the taken side of it. It's composed, of course, to some degree,
but the image is certainly made, for heaven's sakes. I mean, you have to, someone like Evans edited his photographs. And when I tried to publish that in France, Pompidou refused to use the word edit. They said, well, that's not what you use about photographs. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm withdrawing this piece in your catalog. It was, what's his name's catalog on Evans. I said, I'm withdrawing this piece if you won't let me use edit. They just thought, they'd be very precise, you don't use it about photographs, but you do, because he took actually orange pencils and drew them along the sides of markers of his thing. So I think that making a photograph is done, but it's completely different. Taking, I think, is not right. Making is right.
French editors, yes, they are very precise.
They are precise, you know that too.
And protective of
Yeah.
their discipline.
Right.
Very good, it's very good, right. Let's go to another part of your work and thought over the years that has evolved, I think, and you alluded to it earlier when we started talking about is art history. You often speak a little bit wearily, maybe, about the tendency of critics, including art historians, of the last 30 years, which has only strengthened in recent years for very understandable reasons, the tendency to take issue with art from the past that is not commensurate somehow with today's aspirations for a more inclusive and less oppressive, a less racist, a less misogynist, a less classist, a less unequal society. And in several essays in the book, you offer nuanced thoughts on whether there is any point in blaming the artists of what works that may now be distasteful to us, or because we know something about the artists, but especially because the works themselves, even from long ago, sort of offend us for what they represent. And that can, of course, be true. And I was very excited to see newly published lectures here on Brazil and on Baule art in the museum, so art from Côte d'Ivoire in museums. And in this text, Instances of Distance, Eckhout in Brazil and the Baule in the museum, you write against the notion that, and I'll quote you here, if we can show that the social mores supporting the art were wrong or evil, the art is suspect. Can you tell this group, not everyone will know about Eckhout in Brazil, can you tell us a little bit more about the particular situation of Eckhout and his proto-ethnographic work in Brazil and how you came to the conclusions you did?
Sure, I mean, and I would say we're living in a very judgmental time. I mean, that's how I feel, just generally. I'm not going to go into particulars, but this is a judgmental time. And I think that there's a sense that we can correct history. And I don't think the way to understand the past is to correct it. The way to understand it is try to understand what they were doing. And as Mary Beard, a woman I feel mixed about, and she said about tearing down the statues, I think it was somebody in Bristol that was thrown into the water there, and she said, you know, we should keep these statues up to remind us that we also are wrong. We're not all right. In other words, there's this incredible sense today that we know what's right and they didn't. And therefore, history is to be corrected. Now, the thing about Eckhout, he was an artist taken over in the 17th century when the Dutch set up a settlement in northeast Brazil, that part of Brazil that really stretches out halfway across the ocean, it would appear, to Europe. And he went with Prince Mariët, who was considered until now a very generous, lovely guy who had people of different faiths in his settlement there in Recife. And he, in a Dutch way, and 17th century way, brought all kinds of scientists, map makers, artists to record what he was going to find. They took over from the Portuguese and then they lost it quite quickly. They weren't there that long. Okay, and Eckhout was an artist who, not a great artist, but a very, I mean, the Dutch were just, they had fabulous numbers of extremely competent artists, right? Just amazing. And he went out there and he drew, he made paintings of flora and fauna, and he also made paintings of the people he saw there. And these paintings were exhibited in the great house that Frederick Henry, who actually went back to Holland, and the Mariët's house, that great museum in The Hague, was his place when he got home. This is that same man, Mariët's. Okay, so what Eckhout painted were all kinds of really mistos people. Some were slaves brought over, or children of slaves brought over from Africa. Some were Indians and such. And he painted them as couples, and these are full-length paintings, which is unusual for a Dutchman to paint even in Holland. They're very, very rare. I mean, Hals did one, which I used to compare to him, and of course Rembrandt very rarely did them. And he did these marvelous paintings, which we think hung in the house, the short-lived house that Mariët's built there. Now, it's turned out that Mariët's had slaves, that Mariët's, as most Dutch, were into some kind of trade that involved sugar. So if we go back to Holland, where there were no slaves, many of the people we think well of, or did think well of in Holland, in fact were engaged at one remove, but nevertheless engaged in slavery, and even though they didn't permit slaves, right? So Mariët now, this is a lecture I've given, this one on the Eckhout paintings, and it has never been published. And I wanted to sort of defend off and that were reactions. I gave it in Cambridge, England at one point, and some very sort of socially leaning woman artist got up and was furious that I thought that there was anything that wasn't despicable of these portraits. Apparently he got some of the attributes wrong, the wrong clothing on them, the wrong thing. There was a couple who were cannibals, and the woman was holding the body parts, and she thought that was sexist, to be painted as sexist. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was listening to. And it was all just going at him, faulting him for just being for every way. So this has never been published before, but it is in the book. And actually, I said it, now try to be quick about this. I was invited down to Recife, the only time I've been to Brazil, but it was absolutely fabulous, 2002. And I love Brazil because one of the poets I care about most in the world is Elizabeth Bishop, and she spent 15 years there. So Brazil for me is Bishop's Brazil. I mean, you know, it didn't end well for her, but she had a wonderful 15 years. And it was wonderful, and Recife was wonderful, and I love Santana, blah, blah, blah. But the cement baron of this part of Brazil gave a reception for all these paintings, which Frederick Henry had taken back to Holland, and they ended up in Denmark. So the Danish prince was there for this occasion, and all these paintings came back, and so there was a Danish prince, and there was the cement baron, and we were all driven in limousines from Recife out to his house on dirt roads in our huge limousines with all these poor people, miserable people of mixed color, just like these paintings, right? Lining the roads as we drove out. And then we got there, and all these portraits were on the wall, and we were, of course, all white. I brought wrong the wrong clothing. I was just steaming. I got some wool. It was September or something in Brazil. It was so hot, and it was miserable. And then everybody was white. Wonderful drinks, and everybody's white. And then there were all these people, these wonderful portraits, these wonderful real Dutch portraits on the wall. And I went into the bathroom, and all the people in the bathroom serving us were black. And I thought, wow, what a world this is, and how interesting to be in it when we're looking at these actually respectful and splendid, almost heroic paintings that Eckhout painted. Now again, Eckhout's working for a guy who had slaves. He's got mixed up all these people. So this is the kind of thing I feel strong about, and I'm happy to be publishing this because it matters. I want to stand up for what he did, which seems to me good. But as I say, when I've given a lecture, people have gotten up and gotten excited.
Well, I'm just a friendly moderator. So I will encourage people to go to Copenhagen to see these paintings that are 2 meters tall. You know, the Dutch are tall, so they paint people tall, I guess. From the 1640s and 50s, it is a rather unusual set of paintings. They're almost like casta paintings, if you will. They really try to taxonomize the people. And while I agree with you that they have a high degree of individuality, if you look at how they're represented, and the poses are like the Hercules, Belvedere, and they're like famous. They look like Western people in very heroic poses. But there is also some of them, but there's also a sense that you called them portraits, and I think that they are when you think about portraits as representing the individuality of a human being in the Western tradition, I think that's probably the part where people maybe object. Not just the fact that Johan
nobody
Maurits
said that's very clever.
Yeah.
Nobody, you're very clever. You are very clever. Nobody said that. No, good. If somebody said that, I'd say, yeah, that's a very interesting point, Mariët.
For another day. For another day. See, I could have been your student. Now I want to press a little bit on this, because of course these are from now very soon 400 years ago. These are old, and I agree that there is a sense in that while we should discuss history and what happened, and there can be different views of that, and that's all good. We do that in classrooms and in our lectures and whatever we do all the time, in our articles, books. But I have a question for you. Do you think that the distance of time matters here? Do you see a difference between studying and valuing the uniqueness of an Eckhout? And he is a rather rare bird, I would agree. He hadn't heard about post-colonial discourse. He didn't even know what a colony was, basically, at the time. Is there a difference between that and a totally imaginary, I have no one specific in mind here, say an artist from the 1980s or 90s who made work in a particular way, is very highly regarded. The art and the person therefore are celebrated, or persons. And yet the making of that art by the standards of today might involve a harm that was done to the people involved in the making of that art. That harm is now no longer acceptable, or for the first time it's actually seen as a harm or something that needs to be corrected in our own society, and you would actually agree with that it is not a good. Is that art, is there anything, is that art then already always innocent, or should you keep showing it or studying it as just art?
You're
not
talking
history.
about Eckhout now, or you're talking?
No, it's an imaginary artist from the 1980s or 90s, close in time. You're talking about distance in time.
I'm talking about history, and we have to try to understand what they thought and what they were doing then. It is different from us. And what the judgmental view is to say, well, we wouldn't do it that way, so they shouldn't do it that way. That is the difference. So there's no disagreement between us. If somebody does this today, it's a totally different performance. Totally different. But you can't apply, you have to be discriminating. Of course, there's another word that we can't use anymore, right? Discrimination is essential to any critical discourse. But discrimination is a complicated word, and it can be misused, and it can be misconducted. It can be conducted, but we have to discriminate as critics. We're making discriminations. And I would say, if we go back, we want to know, what was Eckhout about? What was he doing when he was doing it? And that's very different from a case, your imaginary case. I'm not quite sure what it is today. It is, of course, different. But I don't think but you don't understand that if you don't understand the historical instance. That's what history is about. It's different from us. Obviously, though, we are thinking it up. So I can't say we're not 20th or 21st century people when we are thinking about that history, obviously. So I'm not erasing myself to look at it. But still, it is different, and I would say those are two different things.
They are, and I think that's often conflated when you get those reactions from people. Exactly. And of course, you can analyze it, as you say. Right. Let's go back, before we go to some questions, let's go back to your journey. I have often thought of you as representing, I still do, a special kind of connection between 20th century Europe, the history of 20th century Europe, and the United States, and a connection that is in some ways deeply informed by that European experience and history, and at the same time you seem so quintessentially American. And even though you love going to France, your family and are at home there. Your family had roots in pre-war Russia, as in the Soviet Union by that time, your dad. You were born on the East Coast, you had a true Harvardian formation, and then you made this leap, I think it was in 1962 or thereabouts, to Berkeley, where you spent 3 decades. Most people here know you mostly as a writer, I think, of course, and a person in the discourse, but you also had a formidably influential role as the builder of a department. You were chair, you were
I was never chair.
But how did you get all these people to come? Like Baxendale.
That was the way to do it. No, I was never chair. Okay. I developed a department without ever being chair, and I would have been a disastrous chair, and they would have all hated me. So the way to do it was to do it without being chair.
Well, you attracted some great artists.
You are a great, great director, and I'm not. We're so different in that. I mean, you've directed so many different kinds of organizations and institutions, and you do it with such aplomb and such fairness, and you get right into it. I mean, I see that you're getting right into them. Good, it's just marvelous. I could not direct anything.
Well, you can be on my PR team. And I thank you for all of that. I really do. I really do, Svetlana.
I did build up that department.
You're
absolutely right, but I didn't do it as chairman.
You were driven by revitalizing the intellectual power of the discipline, and that is a huge contribution. The art of describing was central to it, but it was only one piece of it. It's also creating a community of scholars. And then, so you did that. And the historiography of Dutch 17th century painting causes all sorts of diplomatic incidents in the Netherlands. It's just a very wild and exciting time. And then something interesting, you do something very interesting that I think is very courageous and determined, and I like it. You retired intentionally early, and you moved to New York. Why did you do that, and what is this city to you?
Early retirement or New York or both?
I think they're connected.
Well, early retirement was partly that the culture of graduate students was changing, and in fact there's a couple of my graduate students here who actually were there just about that time, I suppose, when the culture was changing. What suddenly happened is that gender became very important, and we were supposed to, and I just thought, well, that's an issue, but everything isn't gender. And somehow you were supposed to bring this up. Anything you taught, it had to be there, and that had never been said before, and I just sort of didn't agree. And there were other things like that. I just felt out of sorts with the new positioning and demands of graduate students as far as retiring. And I also felt, I love teaching. I won teaching awards, I was a very good teacher, but I began to like teaching the undergraduates much more than the graduate students. They weren't professionals, they were just curious. They just wanted to know, and they didn't have some purpose beyond just going to class and learning something, and that was super duper. So I really taught more and more undergraduates, and then I was tired, and there was this wonderful offer. I was 58 when I was treated as if I were 65. They wanted to get rid of professors who were paid a lot so that they could, I don't know, do something else. Not necessarily get another professor, but just get the money. And so I just took it. I mean, at 58, I got out. I didn't leave Berkeley till 99, and I kept teaching a little bit till 58 to 94. There also were private reasons, because Michael Baxendale was there then, and he was not retiring until into the late 90s, so I wanted to be around while he was. I mean, there were personal reasons. And then we did lots, some of that is in there, a new course we invented. We did lots of things just to keep busy at that time. New York, I'm an Easterner, basically. I'm an Easterner, I'm not a West Coast person. I loved Berkeley, was wonderful, but Berkeley for me was another academy. I'm a bubble person. I grew up in the extraordinary bubble of Cambridge during the Second World War, because I was born in 1936, so it was during the Second World War, and it was full. My father was European Russia. We used to think that was European, and Cambridge was full of Europeans. I mean, it was like a European town. I mean, Renata Bajoli, I could just name them all. Roman Jakobsen. I mean, it was just full. Just full of Gerschenkron, just full of Europeans. That was the world I grew up in Cambridge. It was like Europe, because of the Nazis, sadly, tragically, was European. It was just a marvelous place. I don't say I was a happy child, but it was a marvelous place. And then Berkeley was another academy. I just went from one academy to another academy. Very, very different, but I knew the rules. I knew you gave dinner parties, I knew how you shopped, I knew how you seated people at the dinner table. I'm a very good cook, and that was fun. I loved it. I mean, you know, except I was unusual because I was not only the wife, I was also a professor. And when I was in Berkeley, there were only 3 full professors who were women among 1,500 faculty members. I mean, it's just unbelievable, right? So I wanted to do that, and I did that, and I had children, although I had them very late. My first son was born when I was 29, and everybody thought, well, you can't have a child when you're 29. Well, look at it now. I mean, you know, and that wasn't so many years ago. It was absolutely extraordinary. Okay. Then, when it was time to leave Berkeley, my parents were old and they were living on Washington Square. My father, who taught at Harvard, was teaching at NYU. And so New York was where my grandparents had lived, my Jewish American, not my Russian grandparents. And New York was the other city for me when I was growing up. So it was just natural to come to New York. But the big break then was I left the academy. And I did that, really, I had enough of the academy. And so in New York, and some of those people here, I got to know artists and critics, and just lived in a quite different world, not at all in the academic world.
It is indeed remarkable to see how you entered this broad community of artists and critics here, have made art yourself here as well. And I wonder how you experience, I think this is about how you think of art, this question, and what art is. Do you think there's a categorical difference in how you think and write about the art that occupied you as a scholar and the art that you became a very fine critic of here in contemporary art?
I think the skills and interest and attentiveness I had, skills and interest and attentiveness, that I had for historic art just carried right over when I got to New York. I think if you read me, in fact, I sadly, Rebecca Horn, I like her work so much. She died a week or so ago. And it was a short piece that I wrote on 2 of her things that were exhibited in Hamburg, that I saw in Hamburg in 1993. And I write about that with the same way.
Exactly, very sensitive description. It's a beautiful short piece in the book. An account of actually the process of looking. I want to give some time for people to ask questions or make comments, and when you do, everybody limit yourself please to 1, and there's a mic here that will be passed to you, right here in the front. You just wait 1 second for the mic, please. Because then people can hear.
I admire, one of the reasons I read everything about you, but one sentence killed me. I fall down from the chair. You said, and this is related to my question, the today painting is not victorious. Maybe it's a problem of surviving. Is correct?
No.
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 Okay.
Sorry.
In this case,
I'm not sure I would have wanted to say it,
anyway,
and I know I didn't say it.
I read it today, and I can bring you, but doesn't matter. I want to make some point. I graduated 2 art institutions film in Eastern Europe,
Sorry,
fashion.
question.
Here I will be very short, and I teach art history in Osaka, film and art history. Modestly, I'm a great artist, and I just publish, I will be very short and very modest. I will explain about my
No, but
book.
do you have a question for
Yes,
me?
I have a question.
Well, ask the question.
Yes, the question, first let me to talk, and after I put the question.
Now, please, there are many people who want to ask questions, so
I
you
will
need
be-
to
I
say
will be
short,
very
please.
short, I will be very short.
Please ask the questions.
My book is named Today Art is a Hoax. And my question is about that. And I need 2 minutes to explain.
No, wait, look, I don't agree with you, and I think you've asked the question, sir, and I think we really have to be generous.
I
We have to be generous.
Okay, I be generous with me because I can't.
No, I said we have to be generous.
Okay,
other people.
I will put a question. So, let me to put a question. Duchamp brought a toilet, and today it's $100 million. The Picasso, Mademoiselle d'Avignon, introduced the ugliness in the art. In your opinion, art has to do with beauty. I come from Basel, I see 5,000 works, all
The questions
are,
do you
all
think
are
art has to do
ugly.
with does art have to be beautiful?
Does art have to be beautiful? I don't think beauty is essential, but we probably see beauty in it, yes.
The
But
Greek
okay,
and-
look, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tanto per cambiare. No, first of all, it was a fantastic conversazione. I'm always annoyed when people ask questions these days, starting with thank you, it was wonderful, blah, 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 but it was. And I want to just come back, it's come back to that, a little bit it was left hanging in the air about your moving to photography and what aspect of, and one thing both of you kind of, let's say, left out, which I think is relevant, is the way so it's not the question of mine, it's not about either making or taking, but the way photography is targeted viewing per forza, you know, and that necessary viewing aspect or controlled viewing aspect, which is so central to your enterprise in general.
Maybe you
It's
can
of
comment
Of
on that
course,
a
I
little
mean,
bit.
you know, what Walker Evans said is, I have an eye. He didn't say I have a camera, he said he had an eye. And that, of course, is infuriating to people who really, and he loved cameras, and he owned many, many cameras, but he said asking a photographer which camera they use is like asking a writer which typewriter he uses. Of course, it's not like, he knew it wasn't like that at all, but it's a very smart answer. He just means, shut up, I don't want to talk about cameras. I want to talk about the eye, and that fits me perfectly. He just said, looking is it. That's not quite true, I know, that isn't, I know, but I'm saying you're right on with Evans. On the other hand, that's not quite a total description of
No, not
photography.
but it should be.
Yeah, sure.
Who else might have a question or a comment? James?
It's Richard.
I didn't, my eyes are
Oh,
not good enough.
Um,
No, go ahead.
So I just want to say, Svetlana, this is the same intellect and force of personality that I encountered however many decades ago as a first year graduate student at the age of 21. So if you can imagine being 21 and this woman is your professor, that was an extremely daunting experience, but also inspiring. And my question, so one of the things we disagreed about when I was able, which didn't take me that long, because I'm, disagreeable, and I did talk back, I feel like, to you. Anyway, was about great art and whether art historians needed to be dedicated to great art. And I read an interview, I think you pointed it to me, directed to me fairly recently with Michael Baxendall, where he says it's a little embarrassing, but great art reveals more about the culture than good art. And that's not something I've ever believed. I think bad art can tell us just as much as great art. So Eckhout, you said, was not a great artist, but you needed to tell that story. You needed Eckhout if you were going to tell that story about Brazil and those paintings. So there's a case where you're not writing. And I know, not, you know,
Yeah.
arguably Tiepolo, I don't know who you think is the greatest and who's like sort of, you know, close, but no cigar. But tell me, I guess my question is, do you feel like art that's great reveals more about the culture and that's what we should be writing about?
I think I understand what Michael meant when he said that, and I think it's true, because there is deeper, more significant thought going on, because after all, painting is a way of thought, although it's not words. There is more significant thought going on in a Dürer or a Titian than there is in somebody who's not your Titian. I mean, there's no, I don't think anybody would disagree about that. That doesn't mean that there isn't an interest that other art has. But I think I would have found it, I mean, you wrote fascinatingly about and did a wonderful exhibition in Hirschfield. I don't think I could have done that, Richard. I mean, and that's sort of what we're talking about a bit. And I couldn't have. I would not have been able to sustain an interest in it.
Others? I can't see around corners up there. Thank you.
Just so historically, patronism was the influencer of what art was created. So how much do you think today with capitalism killing art history in your question? How much, what influence does capitalism have on our current art? As opposed to art being influenced by patrons paying for what they want it to be dictated to be created.
What?
The question is, I think, if I may rephrase it, just to see if I heard it correctly on this end, that in the past there were great patrons patronizing art, in the case of Rubens, the Medici, whatever. Today you have a very flourishing global capitalist art market. Does that have a different effect on the making of art today?
Well, certainly. I mean, I've asked that, and it's one of the papers in this, I think. I mean, my God, when you thought of somebody asking Bellini to paint their funeral chapel, and then saying he could do it in his own ways, sua vagata, he could do whatever he wanted to do, but they had the thought of asking Bellini to do it, and they gave him the possibility to do it. And I said, at that point, I think it's in that text, does anybody give artists any good subjects today? What about these people who spend all this money on art? Why don't they think, well, what would I like to have in my house? I mean, even if we go back maybe to the Rockefellers, they did sometime, they got people to come and do something for them. They had some idea. None of these people, they just sort of parade around raking in the stuff. Why don't they think about what it is that interests them to have? I think artists would be thrilled. Why not? So I think it's a very important, I mean, and you know, capitalism, I'm sort of not in touch with that argument, and I must say, Frederick Jameson, who is a great critic of capitalism, and who the New York Times wrote an absolutely depressing obituary on. He was a great critic, a really great critic. I found him difficult, but he was to read. But he was a marvelous critic, and he was a critic of capitalism, or rather he saw the culture he was dealing with as capitalism. I really just don't think that way, but I think somebody can do it very well. Jameson did it absolutely marvelously. I just don't think that way and can't do that stuff. So I don't really, in other words, and also I think sort of capitalism away, why can't you take it back into Renaissance Italy? I mean, is there really some moment when this horrible thing begins and blah, blah, blah? But Jameson was much brighter than that. So I'm ill-equipped to answer anything about capitalism, but I do think that patrons can be very useful, and I think it's very useful for artists to have people around who want their art and also have an idea of what they might like to ask them to do. But nobody seems to do that anymore now. They just want to go flare around at a fair and be shown buying. They're not thinking about what they want. It's ridiculous.
I think you've thought more deeply about capitalism than and you just showed it. We'll have a final question to back before I'll have a final comment for Svetlana.
Hi, when you said art in the talk, and you said art is different from photo, I think you refer to paintings are different from photos. Do you think art as an umbrella term exists? And I guess the larger question is, what is art?
No, I quote Gombrich. Gombrich said, there's no such thing as art, there are only artists. And I'll go with Gombrich. It's a very good way of avoiding the question. I think, and I'll stick with him. There's artists, but we can't define what a thing art is.
It's an enduring question, and thank you. I want to say one more thing about this marvelous book before we give Svetlana a chance to interact with you and to sign books at the table. The book has a revealing coda called A Parting Thought. And one piece I like about that last part is the little introduction you give to it. And Svetlana writes this: I want to end with some words from a letter, actually an email in the form of a letter, that I wrote on impulse to disagree with the way a friend of mine chose to look at paintings. I don't think I was that friend on that particular occasion, but I must say I have received some of those carefully constructed impulsive letters in the forms of emails, and I cherish them, honestly, each and every one. It goes on to reveal that email and the parting thought, and I don't want to do that because I want people to read the book. But please, do you have a parting thought for us this evening?
No, just to thank you for being you, Mariët. I mean, you didn't come to study with me, but we've been friends ever since, and we've had these discussions, and here's another one, and I just thank you for being available and so intelligent and tough. I like you so much.